A teenage girl vanishes from her room, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a mother's shattered heart. 7 years of agonizing search would pass before an accidental discovery behind a bookshelf would reveal the horrifying truth that had been hidden in plain sight all along. The revelation behind that secret door would forever change what we understand about disappearances and the darkness that can exist within our own homes. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The autumn light filtered weakly through the curtains of the Blackwood mansion as Margaret Blackwood stood in her husband's study, surrounded by cardboard boxes. Her fingers trembled as she reached for another medical tome from the shelves that had once been Dr. Jonathan Blackwood's pride. 7 years had passed since her daughter Emily vanished without explanation, and 3 months since Jonathan's sudden heart attack had left her alone with nothing but questions and memories. "Just a few more books," she whispered to herself, the sound barely audible in the oppressive silence of the room. Only the persistent tick of the grandfather clock, stopped at 3:17 for years now, kept her company as she worked. Margaret ran her hand along the leather-bound spine of advanced surgical procedures, remembering how her husband would spend hours absorbed in these pages. The respected surgeon had been admired throughout Ceylon, Massachusetts. No one would have suspected the darkness that Margaret was beginning to sense had lurked behind his professional demeanor. As she pulled the heavy volume from its resting place, something shifted behind the shelf. A metallic sound, subtle but distinct, broke the silence. Margaret froze, her breath catching in her throat. "What on earth?" she murmured, setting the book aside. The 45-year-old widow pressed her palm against the wooden shelf, feeling it give slightly under her touch. Something clicked again, more definitively this time. Before her widening eyes, the entire bookcase began to move, groaning against aged hinges that hadn't been disturbed in years. The massive structure swung slowly outward, revealing what was unmistakably a door where there should have been only wall. It was painted to match the study's deep green wallpaper, its outline nearly invisible when closed. A small brass handle gleamed dully in the afternoon light. Margaret stumbled backward, knocking over an empty box. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the first icy tendrils of dread crawled up her spine. She thought of Emily, her beautiful 14-year-old daughter who had disappeared from their living room on an ordinary October day in 1950. She thought of Detective Thomas O'Malley's frustrated face as the investigation had gone cold month after month. "Oh my God," she whispered, one hand flying to her mouth. "Jonathan, what did you do?" The homemaker stood frozen, staring at the hidden entrance, unable to move forward, yet unable to turn away. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her marriage, her home, it all teetered on the edge of an abyss she wasn't sure she had the courage to face. Margaret Blackwood stepped into the hidden room, her lantern casting long shadows across the confined space. The beam of light revealed a small, windowless chamber no larger than a servant's quarters. Dust particles swirled in the air, disturbed for the first time in what seemed like ages, dancing in the pale light like tiny ghosts. The musty odor of abandonment and decay assaulted her senses, a mixture of old wood, mildew, and something indefinably sad. "Emily," she whispered, her voice breaking the oppressive silence. The room contained only the barest essentials, a narrow cot pressed against one wall, a small wooden table, and a rickety chair. On the cot lay a faded blue blanket, its edges frayed from constant handling. Margaret recognized it immediately. She had knitted it herself during her pregnancy, tiny stitches formed with love and anticipation. Beside the blanket sat a well-worn doll with button eyes and yarn hair, Emily's favorite companion since childhood. "Miss Penny," her daughter had named it. The sight of the toy, so out of place in this prison, yet so unmistakably her daughter's, sent a wave of nausea through Margaret's body. But it was what rested on the table that caused her heart to nearly stop. A leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth from handling, lay precisely centered on the wooden surface. Emily's diary, the one Margaret had given her for her 13th birthday, just months before her disappearance. The 45-year-old widow's knees buckled beneath her. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself, the lantern swinging wildly in her other hand, momentarily plunging the room into disorienting shadows. The horrifying truth crashed over her like a physical blow. Emily had been here, imprisoned mere feet away from the life they had shared together, separated only by the thickness of a wall and a cleverly concealed door. For 7 years, while Margaret had searched, grieved, and finally tried to move forward after her husband's death, her daughter had been here, so close she could have heard her mother's footsteps, her voice, perhaps even her tears. Margaret's trembling hand hovered over the diary. Did she dare read it? Did she have the strength to face whatever truths lay within those pages? The answers she had desperately sought for 7 years were literally at her fingertips. Yet terror gripped her heart. What horrors would Emily's words reveal about Dr. Jonathan Blackwood, the man Margaret had loved and mourned? With a deep breath that seemed to draw strength from the very depths of her soul, she picked up the diary. The leather felt warm beneath her fingers, almost alive, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. She opened the cover, desperate for answers, yet terrified of the truth she might find within her daughter's words. Margaret's trembling fingers turned the pages of Emily's diary, each word a knife to her heart. The first entry, dated October 12th, 1950, was written in her daughter's familiar rounded script. Papa says I am to stay here until I learn my lesson. He says proper young ladies don't attend dances with boys like Tommy Wilkins. The mother's breath caught in her throat as she continued reading. Early entries showed confusion and hope. Emily believed her punishment would be temporary. Papa brought me soup today. He says maybe next week I can come out if I promise to be good. But as days turned to weeks, the tone shifted dramatically. Day 23. Papa says I'm still not ready to rejoin the family. I heard Mom calling my name yesterday. Why doesn't she come find me? Doesn't she care that I'm gone? Margaret clutched her chest, tears streaming down her face. All those years she had searched the town, put up posters, begged the police to keep looking, while Emily was imprisoned mere feet away, believing she had been abandoned. Later entries grew darker still. I scratch marks on the wall now, one for each day. Papa says Mom knows where I am and agrees with my punishment. I don't believe him anymore. The diary revealed Dr. Jonathan Blackwood's calculated cruelty. He had engineered the hidden room years before Emily's disappearance, soundproofing the walls and installing a ventilation system that wouldn't be detected. The respected surgeon had created a perfect prison within their home, while maintaining his reputation in the community. Sometimes I hear other voices with Papa. A man called Harold comes sometimes. They talk about teaching discipline and proper behavior. I'm scared of what they mean. Margaret recognized the name, Dr. Harold Westbrook, her husband's colleague who had comforted her during the search for Emily. The realization made bile rise in her throat. The entries became more sporadic as months passed. I don't know how long I've been here anymore. The marks on the wall don't make sense now. Papa says, if I try to escape again, there will be consequences. Horror and guilt consumed Margaret as she read about her daughter's desperate attempts to signal her presence, scratching at walls during night hours, trying to create noise when she heard Margaret's footsteps. Jonathan had explained away any unusual sounds as the old house settling or mice in the walls. The final entries were the most devastating. And I think Mum has forgotten me. Maybe she has a new daughter now. I still remember her face, but it's getting harder. Sometimes I dream she finds me, but I wake up in the same dark room, always the same room. Margaret closed the diary, her entire body shaking with grief and rage. How could she not have known? How could the man she loved have committed such monstrous acts against their child? And most importantly, where was Emily now? With trembling hands, Margaret Blackwood reached for the telephone. Her mind was racing, heart pounding against her ribs as she dialed the number she'd called countless times over the past 7 years. Detective Thomas O'Malley answered on the third ring. "I found something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please come quickly." Within 30 minutes, O'Malley's automobile pulled into the driveway of the Blackwood mansion. The detective stepped out, his weathered face showing both concern and a flicker of something else, vindication. He'd never believed Emily had simply run away, despite what others on the force had concluded. "Show me," he said simply, following Margaret through the house to Jonathan's study. When the bookcase swung open, revealing the hidden compartment, O'Malley's breath caught. "I knew it," he muttered, pulling out his notepad. "I always felt there was more to this case." The detective called for backup, and soon the mansion buzzed with activity. Officers photographed the secret room, carefully documenting every detail. They collected evidence methodically. Rusted locks that had secured the door from the outside, discarded food tins stacked neatly in a corner, and hidden ledgers tucked beneath the narrow cot. "We found this behind a loose floorboard," one officer said, holding up a small metal box. Inside were more of Emily's belongings: a hairbrush with strands of dark hair, a tarnished locket, and scraps of paper with desperate messages that never reached their intended recipients. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching as strangers invaded the space where her daughter had been imprisoned. The weight of her ignorance crushed down on her shoulders. How many times had she walked past this wall, never knowing Emily was just on the other side? "Detective," she called, her voice stronger now, fueled by rage and determination. She held out the diary, its pages worn from Emily's touch. "Read it. You need to see what he did to her." O'Malley took the diary carefully, as if handling evidence from a crime scene, which, she realized with horror, it was. He nodded solemnly. "We'll pursue every lead, Mrs. Blackwood. I promise you that." His eyes, usually guarded and professional, softened with genuine compassion. "But I need to warn you, what we uncover may be even darker than you fear. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret looked back at the hidden room, thinking of her daughter trapped in darkness while life continued around her. She thought of Jonathan, the man she'd loved, the monster she'd never truly known. "I've lived with shadows for 7 years, detective. I'm ready for the truth, no matter how painful." O'Malley nodded, understanding the courage it took to face such horrors. "Then we'll find it together." Margaret continued reading Emily's diary, her hands trembling with each turn of the page. The entries grew increasingly disturbing as her daughter described the regular visits from Dr. Jonathan Blackwood. "Father comes at night," one passage read. "He brings food and water, but never speaks to me except to say I'm being punished for my own good." Even more shocking were the mentions of Martha Sullivan. Emily had written about hearing the housekeeper's familiar footsteps outside the hidden room, noting how the woman would sometimes pause before continuing down the hallway. "Martha must know I'm here," Emily had scrawled in desperate handwriting. "Why won't she help me?" Margaret called Detective Thomas O'Malley immediately. The officer arrived within the hour, his weathered face grim as he examined the secret compartment and the diary. He took photographs of the room, carefully documenting everything from the locks to the ventilation system. "I need to speak with Martha," Margaret said, her voice hollow yet determined. "She's still in town. She worked for us for 15 years. When confronted at her modest apartment across town, Martha initially feigned ignorance. "I don't know anything about a hidden room," the housekeeper insisted, avoiding Margaret's gaze. "Dr. Blackwood was a good man, a respected doctor." Margaret slammed the diary onto the kitchen table. "My daughter wrote about you, Martha. She heard you walking past her prison every day for years." The colour drained from Martha's face as she stared at the familiar handwriting. Her composure crumbled, tears welling in her eyes. "He paid me extra," she whispered, shame evident in every word. "Told me to mind my own business. That certain areas of the house were private for his medical research. You knew," Margaret's voice broke, "you knew my child was trapped in there." Martha nodded, her shoulders slumping. "I heard things at night. Footsteps when the house should have been quiet. Once I saw the doctor bringing a young girl through the back entrance. When I asked, he said she was a patient from the orphanage, needing special treatment." O'Malley leaned forward. "How many girls did you see?" "3, maybe 4 over the years," Martha admitted. "Always at night, always through the back door. Dr. Blackwood would escort them himself, and I'd see him leading different men into his study afterward." Margaret felt sick. Different men. Businessmen, other doctors. Dr. Westbrook came often. Martha reached for Margaret's hand. "I should have said something. God forgive me. I should have helped those girls." O'Malley's jaw tightened as he made notes. "We're going to need a formal statement, Miss Sullivan. This case just got much bigger than a single missing person." Detective Thomas O'Malley spread the yellowed police files across his desk, his weathered hands carefully arranging each document. 7 years of dust had settled on these records, but the detective's determination remained unwavering. He'd always sensed something wasn't right about Emily Blackwood's disappearance. "I'm reopening every angle," O'Malley explained to Margaret, who sat across from him, dark circles under her eyes betraying her sleepless nights. "We missed something back then. I won't let that happen again." The detective began interviewing former staff members who had worked at the Blackwood mansion. A groundskeeper recalled regular deliveries that arrived at unusual hours. "Medical supplies," he said, "boxes and boxes of them. Dr. Blackwood always insisted on receiving them personally." Margaret felt physically ill as O'Malley uncovered a pattern of deliveries spanning years. Surgical equipment, medications, and monitoring devices, all under the guise of private patient care. The detective's investigation revealed connections to several clinics where Jonathan had privileges and orphanages where he volunteered his services. "These institutions all have something in common," O'Malley said, his voice grave, as he showed Margaret a map with locations circled in red. Girls disappeared from each one, always vulnerable ones, without family asking questions. Back at the mansion, Margaret wandered through rooms that once felt like home, but now seemed filled with sinister secrets. She paused before her husband's portrait hanging in the study. The kind eyes, the gentle smile. How had she lived alongside this man for decades, without seeing his true nature? "He brought me tea every night," she whispered to Martha Sullivan, who stood nearby with tears streaming down her lined face. "He kissed Emily's forehead before bed. He saved lives at the hospital." The housekeeper wrung her hands. "I should have said something when I heard noises at night. I convinced myself it was nothing." Margaret picked up a framed photograph, their family at the lake house. Jonathan's arm around her shoulders, Emily laughing between them, the memory fractured like glass in her mind, reimagined with the knowledge that her husband had been planning her daughter's imprisonment even then. "I shared his bed," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I loved him. I grieved when he died, and all along." O'Malley called that evening with more disturbing news. Financial records showed substantial deposits to Jonathan's private account, money that couldn't be explained by his surgeon's salary. "We're dealing with something bigger than Emily's disappearance," the detective explained. "Your husband was involved in something systematic, something organized." Margaret hung up the telephone and sank to the floor, surrounded by the elegant furnishings of a life built on lies. The respected surgeon, the devoted father, the loving husband, all facades hiding a monster she had never truly known. Detective Thomas O'Malley knelt beside the narrow cot, his experienced eyes scanning every inch of the hidden room. Something about the uneven floorboards caught his attention. Carefully, he pressed along the edges of the bed frame until a soft click revealed a compartment beneath. "Margaret, come look at this," he called, his voice echoing in the confined space. Margaret Blackwood approached hesitantly, her hands trembling as O'Malley lifted a small metal box from the hidden space. Inside lay several folded papers, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. "Letters," she whispered, reaching for them with reverent caution. The detective handed her the topmost document, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The handwriting, those familiar loops and curves, belonged unmistakably to Emily. More shocking was the date scrawled in the corner, just 6 months earlier. "Ah, this can't be," she murmured, tears welling in her eyes as she began to read. "Dearest mother," the letter began, "I still dream of your face, though the years have blurred some details. I hope someday someone will find this. I'm still here, still waiting. David says we shouldn't lose hope, but sometimes it's hard to remember what hope feels like." Margaret collapsed onto the cot, the paper clutched to her chest. "She's alive," she said, her voice breaking. My daughter is alive." O'Malley carefully gathered the remaining documents, medical notes, crude maps drawn in a shaky hand, and lists of names. "This changes everything," he said, his professional demeanor momentarily giving way to genuine emotion. "We're no longer looking for answers about a disappearance. We're conducting a rescue operation." Back at the police station, the detective assembled his team, spreading the newfound evidence across the conference table. "Emily mentions 3 locations in her letter," he explained, pointing to the crude map. "She references the farm with the red barn, the clinic by the river, and something called Westbrook Sanctuary." One officer looked up sharply. "Westbrook, as in Dr. Harold Westbrook. He and Dr. Blackwood were colleagues at Massachusetts General." Margaret nodded, recalling the distinguished physician who had dined at their home several times. "Jonathan always spoke highly of him," she said, the irony bitter on her tongue. For the first time in 7 years, genuine hope flickered in Margaret's eyes. O'Malley noticed the change and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll find her," he promised. "Every name, every location in this letter, we'll track them all down. Emily left us breadcrumbs, and we're going to follow them." The investigation room buzzed with renewed energy as officers made calls, pulled records, and pinned locations to maps. The possibility that Emily Blackwood might still be alive transformed what had been a cold case into the department's most urgent priority. Margaret's hands trembled as she returned to Emily's diary, each page revealing a more disturbing reality than the last. The once neat handwriting of her daughter had deteriorated into jagged, desperate scrawls that sometimes trailed off mid-sentence. "Another girl came today," one entry read. "She cried all night. Father says she'll learn to be quiet, just like I did." Margaret's throat tightened as she turned the page. Emily had documented the arrival and departure of at least 7 other girls over the years, some staying for months before mysteriously going away. The diary spoke of a young man named David, brought to the farm when Emily was 17. Unlike the others, he wasn't kept in isolation. "David brings me food now instead of Martha," Emily had written. He whispers that he's trapped too. His eyes are kind. For the first time in 3 years, I don't feel completely alone. Their connection deepened through shared captivity. David slipped me a pencil today. Said if I hide it well, I can keep writing. He risks punishment to help me remember who I am. Margaret's heart shattered as she read about her daughter's first pregnancy at 16. Father and Dr. Westbrook came at night. They spoke about the procedure, while I pretended to sleep. I'm scared. My body feels different. Later entries described the horror of childbirth without proper medical care, followed by the cruelest act of all. They took my baby. I only held her for minutes. Father said she was going to a proper family who paid good money. I named her Margaret in my heart, though I never said it aloud. Emily had documented overheard conversations between Dr. Jonathan Blackwood and his associates, fragments about adoption papers, wealthy clients, and untraceable arrangements. One passage mentioned buyers from New York who prefer newborns. Detective O'Malley read these sections with growing fury, his notepad filling with names and dates. Your husband was running an illegal adoption ring, he told Margaret, using these girls as... He couldn't finish the sentence. Margaret closed the diary, her grief transforming into steely resolve. I want them all found, she said. Every girl, every baby, every man who participated. I don't care who they are or how powerful. My husband is beyond earthly justice, but the others aren't. She stared at the photograph of Jonathan Blackwood on the mantel, the respected surgeon's smile now sinister in her eyes. I lived with a monster for 20 years and never knew it, she whispered. And I won't rest until I've undone every bit of harm he caused. O'Malley nodded grimly. We'll find Emily, he promised, and when we do, we'll bring down everyone involved in this nightmare. Detective Thomas O'Malley gathered his most trusted officers at the Silent Police Department. The weathered detective spread photographs and documents across the table, his eyes reflecting determination accumulated over 7 years of frustration. We're no longer looking for just one missing girl, he announced, pointing to a map marked with red pins. These institutions, orphanages, medical facilities, all had connections to Dr. Blackwood, and all reported missing girls between 1950 and 1957. The team divided responsibilities. 2 officers would investigate the medical supply deliveries. Another would interview staff from the orphanages, while O'Malley himself would coordinate with authorities in neighboring states. Back at the mansion, Margaret Blackwood sat motionless by the window, Emily's diary clutched in her trembling hands. The weight of her husband's betrayal crushed her chest, making each breath painful. How could Jonathan, the man who had kissed her goodnight for 20 years, have imprisoned their daughter mere feet away? The thought made her stomach turn. Mrs. Blackwood. Martha Sullivan stood hesitantly at the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed. I've made some tea. Margaret looked up at the housekeeper, anger flashing briefly before dissolving into exhaustion. How could you not know, Martha? She was here all along. The older woman placed the teacup down with shaking hands. I suspected something wasn't right, she whispered. Dr. Westbrook would visit at strange hours, always going straight to your husband's study. They'd lock the door. Harold Westbrook. Margaret's attention sharpened. Jonathan's colleague from the hospital. Martha nodded. They would speak in hushed tones. Once I heard them arguing about merchandise and delivery schedules. Her voice broke. I told myself they were discussing medical supplies. Meanwhile, O'Malley was uncovering a horrifying pattern. Records showed that 23 girls had vanished from institutions where Dr. Blackwood had served on the board or had medical privileges. Most were between 13 and 16 years old. Most had no family searching for them. They were targeting the vulnerable, he told his team. Girls nobody would miss. When the telephone rang at the mansion, Margaret answered immediately. O'Malley's voice was grim but focused. We've found something, Mrs. Blackwood. This isn't just about Emily anymore. Your husband and Dr. Westbrook, they were running something much bigger. We believe they were trafficking young girls across state lines." Margaret closed her eyes, the room spinning around her. "The FBI is getting involved," the detective continued. "We need to move quickly before anyone destroys evidence." As she hung up the telephone, Margaret turned to Martha. "You're going to tell me everything you remember. Every visitor, every strange delivery, every odd conversation you overheard." Her voice hardened with resolve. "My daughter spent 7 years in darkness while we lived our lives above her. I won't let another day pass without fighting for her, and for all the others." Detective Thomas O'Malley assembled a small team of officers to investigate the medical contacts and orphanages connected to Dr. Jonathan Blackwood. The detective's office walls were now covered with photographs, names, and locations, a web of connections that grew more disturbing by the day. Meanwhile, Margaret Blackwood paced the floors of her home, caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Rage burned through her veins one moment, only to be washed away by waves of crushing guilt the next. How could she have lived under the same roof, slept in the same bed as a monster, and never suspected? The question tormented her day and night. Martha Sullivan, the housekeeper whose silence had enabled years of suffering, approached Margaret one evening, her eyes downcast and voice trembling. "I want to help," she whispered. "There was a doctor who used to visit at strange hours. Dr. Harold Westbrook. He and your husband would lock themselves in the study for hours." Margaret's hands shook as she telephoned O'Malley with this new information. The detective added Westbrook's name to his growing investigation board. We're finding a pattern," O'Malley explained when he visited the Blackwood residence the following day. "Dozens of young girls have vanished from institutions where your husband had medical privileges. Most had no family to report them missing." He spread several files across the dining table, case reports of missing girls spanning 6 years and 3 counties. Margaret's stomach turned as she recognized the dates matching entries in Emily's diary. "And this isn't just about Emily anymore," the detective said, his voice grave. "We're looking at what appears to be an organized trafficking operation crossing state lines." Martha, hovering nearby, offered another crucial detail. Dr. Blackwood often mentioned needing to make deliveries to the country, said it was medical supplies for rural patients. O'Malley nodded grimly. "We've found records of medical supplies, sedatives, painkillers, birthing equipment, ordered in quantities no single practitioner would need." That evening, as Margaret continued reading through her daughter's diary, she found an entry that made her blood run cold. "They took Sarah away today. She screamed for hours before they came. Father says I'll be moved to the farm soon too, where the air smells of hay and iron." Margaret suddenly recalled Jonathan's frequent mentions of a rehabilitation retreat he claimed to fund outside of Ceylon, a place he described as helping troubled young women. She had never visited, never questioned. When she shared this revelation with O'Malley, his eyes narrowed with determination. This farm could be where they're keeping Emily and the others. "It's our best lead." The investigation had transformed from a missing person case into something far more sinister, a trafficking ring operating under the respectable veneer of medical authority. The early morning fog hung over the Massachusetts countryside as Detective Thomas O'Malley led a convoy of police vehicles toward the remote farm. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the warrant tucked safely in his jacket pocket. After 7 agonizing years, they might finally find Emily Blackwood. "We'll approach from both sides," O'Malley instructed the state police officers gathered around him at the perimeter. "Remember, these women may be traumatized. Proceed with caution." The property stood eerily silent as they advanced. No dogs barking, no signs of activity, just an old farmhouse and a large converted barn standing like sentinels against the grey sky. Margaret Blackwood waited in an automobile at a safe distance, her heart pounding with both hope and dread. The officers moved methodically through the main house, finding it empty but with clear signs of occupation, food supplies, medical equipment, and a desk filled with paperwork. O'Malley's attention quickly turned to the barn, its windows covered with heavy fabric from the inside. "Police! We have a warrant!" he called as they breached the entrance. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and something medicinal. The barn had been transformed, partitioned into small cells with padlocked doors. The detective felt a chill run through him as he observed the makeshift prison. Officers began documenting everything: worn blankets on narrow cots, small piles of children's shoes and personal items. In one corner, hidden beneath floorboards, they discovered a cache of diaries, each in different handwriting, each telling a similar story of captivity and abuse. "There's someone here," called an officer from the back of the structure. "I hear movement." O'Malley rushed toward a heavy door with multiple locks. "This is the police. We're here to help you. Stand back from the door." After breaking through, the officers were met with a sight that stopped them cold. 12 young women huddled together in a large room, their faces showing a mixture of fear, disbelief, and fragile hope. They were thin, pale from lack of sunlight, some visibly pregnant. "Emily," O'Malley called softly. "Emily Blackwood." A slender woman with haunted eyes stepped forward. At 21, she barely resembled the 14-year-old from the photographs, but there was no mistaking her identity. Her pregnancy was advanced, her body frail, but her eyes still held that spark of determination Margaret had described. "You came," Emily whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "So you actually came." When Margaret was finally allowed to approach the barn, she ran with all her might. The moment she saw her daughter emerging, supported by a female officer, she collapsed to her knees. 7 years of grief, searching, and hope culminated in this moment as mother and daughter were finally reunited, clinging to each other as if afraid the other might disappear. Detective Thomas O'Malley led the raid on the remote farm with military precision. State police officers surrounded the converted barn, weapons drawn as they breached the weathered wooden doors. The eerie silence that greeted them sent chills down their spines. No sounds of struggle, only the distant creaking of old timber. Inside, the officers discovered a nightmare made real. The barn had been transformed into a prison. Makeshift cells lined the walls, each containing a narrow bed and minimal furnishings. Medical supplies were stacked neatly in one corner: syringes, bandages, and prenatal vitamins. In another corner, officers uncovered a filing cabinet filled with forged adoption records, each document meticulously crafted to obscure the horrific truth. "Check every room," O'Malley ordered, his voice tight with controlled fury. As they moved deeper into the structure, an officer called out after discovering a pile of diaries hidden beneath floorboards, each in different handwriting, each telling fragments of the same terrible story. The team approached a heavy locked door at the rear of the barn. After breaking it open, they found themselves face to face with 12 young women, pale, frightened, and visibly malnourished. Some cowered in corners while others stood defiantly, protecting the younger girls. Among them stood Emily Blackwood, now 21, her gaunt face bearing a striking resemblance to her mother's photographs. Her swollen belly revealed an advanced pregnancy. When Margaret Blackwood arrived at the scene, escorted by a female officer, she collapsed at the sight of her daughter. 7 years of searching, of nightmares and prayers, crystallized into this single moment. Emily, despite her weakened state, rushed toward her mother with surprising strength. "Mom," she whispered, the word catching in her throat as tears streamed down her hollow cheeks. Margaret embraced her daughter, careful of her pregnant belly. unable to form words through her sobs. The officers turned away, giving them privacy in this raw moment of reunion. When Emily finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "He lied to me. He said you didn't want me anymore." She clung to Margaret's arms. "But I never lost hope you'd find me." The other girls watched silently, their own traumas reflected in Emily's tears. Medical personnel arrived to examine the survivors, documenting their conditions and the evidence of forced pregnancies. Several of the younger women spoke of babies taken away immediately after birth, never to be seen again. As mother and daughter held each other, Detective O'Malley surveyed the scene. His jaw clenched in determination. This wasn't just Emily's rescue, it was the unraveling of a sophisticated trafficking network that had operated undetected for years. The healing would be long and painful, but today, at least, justice had begun its work. The full extent of the farm's horror unfolded as authorities processed the scene. 12 young women, including Emily Blackwood, had been imprisoned for years in the converted barn, forced into repeated pregnancies, and separated from their babies shortly after birth. The makeshift medical area contained surgical equipment, delivery tables, and detailed records of each birth, clinical documentation of unspeakable suffering. Detective Thomas O'Malley stood in the center of the operation room, his face grim as he surveyed the evidence. "We've got enough here to put these monsters away for life," he said to the state police captain. Medical supplies labeled with clinic names connected to Dr. Jonathan Blackwood's network lay scattered across metal tables. Nearby, a filing cabinet revealed hundreds of forged adoption records, each representing a child stolen and sold. The babies were delivered to wealthy families across state lines, O'Malley explained to Margaret as they stood outside the farm. "Cash transactions, no questions asked. Your husband and Westbrook created a perfect system. The girls were invisible, and the babies highly valuable." Margaret barely registered his words. Her focus remained entirely on her daughter, who sat wrapped in a blanket in the back of an ambulance, visibly pregnant and painfully thin. The emotional shock of finding Emily alive after 7 years of grief had left Margaret both elated and devastated. "She's asking for you," a nurse said gently. Inside the vehicle, Emily's eyes, so like her father's, yet filled with a warmth he never truly possessed, locked onto Margaret's. "Mom," she whispered, the word carrying 7 years of longing. Margaret took her daughter's hand, noticing the calluses and scars that told stories she wasn't ready to hear. "I'm here now," she said. "I'm never leaving you again." Emily clung to her mother with surprising strength. "He told me you knew," she confessed, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks, "that you had agreed to the punishment, but I never truly believed it. I never lost hope you'd find me." Their reunion was raw, grief and love intertwined so tightly they could scarcely be separated. Margaret stroked Emily's hair, now long and dull, remembering the vibrant 14-year-old who had vanished from their living room. "The other girls," Emily said suddenly, her voice stronger. "They need help too. Some have been here longer than me." In the days that followed, Margaret became the unexpected cornerstone for the survivors. While doctors tended to their physical needs, she provided something equally vital, a mother's unwavering support. Each evening, she sat beside Emily's hospital bed, sometimes reading passages from the diary, sometimes simply holding her hand in silence. "We're going to get through this," Margaret promised, her voice steady despite her breaking heart. "Your baby, your life, will reclaim everything he took from you." With each passing day, the investigation into the Blackwood case grew more extensive. Detective Thomas O'Malley methodically sorted through stacks of documents, uncovering dozens of forged birth certificates meticulously crafted to appear legitimate. The correspondence between Dr. Jonathan Blackwood and Dr. Harold Westbrook revealed a calculated system of coded messages about merchandise and special deliveries, their callous terminology for the babies they had trafficked. These men were operating this ring for over a decade, O'Malley explained to Margaret as they reviewed the evidence. The detective's face showed the strain of sleepless nights, but his determination remained unwavering. Martha Sullivan, her eyes downcast with shame, approached Margaret one evening. "There's something else," the housekeeper whispered. "I found this years ago, but was too afraid to say anything." From her trembling hands, she produced a small locked box she had discovered hidden in the cellar behind some old paint cans. When they pried it open, Margaret gasped. Inside lay dozens of photographs of newborns, each with a number and date written on the back. Accompanying the photos were meticulously maintained lists of buyers, prominent names from across New England, including judges, politicians, and business leaders. Letters detailed arrangements for private adoptions, with staggering sums exchanged. "This is everything we need," O'Malley said, his voice tight with controlled anger. The FBI was immediately brought in, and within 48 hours, agents coordinated simultaneous raids across 6 states. Dr. Westbrook was arrested at his country club during lunch, his face ashen as agents escorted him past shocked members of Salem's elite. The physician's reputation as a pillar of the community crumbled instantly as newspapers ran the headline, "Respected Doctor Implicated in Baby Trafficking Ring." Meanwhile, Margaret spent every possible moment at Emily's bedside in the hospital. Her daughter's physical recovery was progressing, but the emotional wounds ran deeper. "I'll read to you," Margaret offered, gently stroking Emily's hair. The simple act of maternal care seemed to soothe them both. "Will they find all the babies?" Emily asked one afternoon, her voice barely audible. "O'Malley promised they're trying," Margaret answered. "The FBI has special agents just for that." The case dominated national headlines, sending shockwaves through the typically reserved New England community. Neighbors who had once praised Dr. Blackwood now whispered behind closed doors, questioning how such horror had existed in their midst for years. As Margaret watched her daughter sleep, she made a silent vow to help Emily reclaim her life and her child, no matter what it took. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in 7 years, they faced it together. The investigation uncovered a trove of damning evidence. Dozens of forged birth certificates lay spread across Detective Thomas O'Malley's desk, each document a testament to the elaborate scheme Dr. Blackwood and Dr. Harold Westbrook had orchestrated. Correspondence between the two physicians revealed coded language about merchandise and special deliveries, their callous terminology for the babies they had trafficked. Martha Sullivan, the housekeeper whose silence had enabled years of suffering, now sought redemption through action. She approached Margaret Blackwood one evening, her weathered hands trembling as she presented a locked wooden box. "I found this hidden behind the coal bin in the cellar," Martha explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have come forward years ago. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Blackwood." When they pried open the box, Margaret gasped. Inside lay meticulously organized photographs of newborns, each with handwritten notes on the back. Lists of buyers, prominent families from across New England, filled a leather-bound ledger. Letters from these families expressed gratitude for their special arrangements with Dr. Blackwood, some including substantial bank drafts as payment. "This is monstrous," Margaret whispered, her fingers tracing the image of an infant who might have been Emily's child. The evidence proved overwhelming. Within days, O'Malley and FBI agents began making arrests, starting with Dr. Westbrook at his medical practice. The physician's face drained of color as agents led him through his waiting room in handcuffs, past patients who watched in stunned silence. The case exploded across newspapers throughout Massachusetts. Doctors, baby trafficking ring exposed, screamed the headlines. Reporters descended on Silen, transforming the quiet New England town into the epicenter of a national scandal. Prominent families named in the documents hastily left for extended vacations, their empty estates standing as silent accomplices. In the Blackwood home, now stripped of its dark secrets, Margaret sat with Emily, showing her the evidence that would bring her captors to justice. "They'll pay for what they did to you," Margaret promised, holding her daughter's hand. "To all of you." Emily nodded, her eyes reflecting both pain and determination. "I want to testify," she said. "I need to speak for those who can't." Martha, working to atone for her years of willful blindness, brought tea and sat with them. The three women, once connected by a household, now bound by trauma and the pursuit of justice, formed an unlikely alliance. "The other girls need someone who understands," Martha said softly. "I'll help them however I can." Outside, reporters continued to gather, their cameras flashing as officials carried box after box of evidence from the Blackwood mansion. The tight-lipped community of Silen would never be the same, its darkest secret finally exposed to the light. Emily Blackwood, with the unwavering support of her mother, agreed to testify against the architects of her nightmare. The courtroom fell silent as she took the stand, her slender frame carrying the weight of 7 lost years. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady as she recounted her ordeal. "I was 14 when my father locked me away," she began, her eyes fixed on a point above the crowd. "He told me it was punishment for wanting to attend a school dance. I believed it would only last a few days." The jury listened, transfixed, as Emily described the progression from punishment to imprisonment. She detailed how Dr. Jonathan Blackwood had engineered the hidden room, how he would visit with food and sometimes books, always reminding her that her behavior determined her release, a release that never came. Margaret sat in the front row of the gallery, her face a portrait of anguish and pride. Each revelation was like a knife to her heart, yet she refused to look away. This was her penance, to bear witness to the suffering she had failed to prevent. Emily's testimony grew more harrowing as she described meeting David, another captive brought to the farm. Their shared trauma had forged an unbreakable bond, a lifeline in the darkness. Now reunited outside captivity, they were slowly building a future neither had dared imagine possible. "We helped each other survive," Emily said, a flicker of warmth briefly lighting her eyes. "When they took my babies, David would hold me through the night." The prosecutor gently guided her through the most difficult parts of her testimony, the forced pregnancies, the children taken from her arms, the network of doctors and facilitators who profited from their suffering. Martha Sullivan's testimony followed, her confession adding crucial details about visitors to the Blackwood residence and conversations overheard. The former housekeeper, once complicit through silence, now sought redemption through truth. "I knew something wasn't right," Martha admitted, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I chose not to see what was happening under that roof." Throughout the proceedings, Detective Thomas O'Malley sat beside Margaret, occasionally placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The veteran officer had pursued this case relentlessly, and now watched as justice finally took shape. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered daily, transforming the Blackwood case into national news. The quiet New England town of Silen found itself under scrutiny, as neighbors questioned how such horrors could unfold in their midst. For Emily, each day in court was exhausting yet empowering. With every truth spoken, she reclaimed a piece of herself. And with Margaret and David waiting to embrace her after each session, she began to believe in the possibility of healing. The courtroom fell silent as the jury foreman rose to deliver the verdict. After 3 weeks of harrowing testimony and mountains of evidence, justice was finally within reach. Dr. Harold Westbrook sat motionless at the defense table, his once prestigious reputation now in tatters. On all counts of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and human trafficking, we find the defendant guilty, the foreman announced, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom. A collective exhale rippled through the gallery. Margaret Blackwood clutched her handkerchief tightly, tears streaming down her face. The verdict was the same for each of the 7 conspirators, guilty on all counts. The trafficking ring that had operated with impunity for years was finally exposed and dismantled. Emily Blackwood had been the prosecution's star witness. Her testimony, delivered with unwavering clarity despite her trauma, had proven devastating. She recounted the years spent in darkness, first in her own home and then at the remote farm. The young woman described how her father had manipulated her, convincing her that she was being punished for disobedience before eventually revealing his true purpose. "He told me I was special," Emily had testified, her voice steady despite the horror of her words. "That the babies I carried would go to important people who would protect him, that no one would ever believe me if I tried to tell." Margaret watched from the gallery each day, her heart breaking anew with every revelation. The mother's testimony about discovering the hidden room had moved many jurors to tears. Detective Thomas O'Malley sat beside her throughout the proceedings, a steady presence as the full scope of Dr. Jonathan Blackwood's crimes was laid bare. Martha Sullivan's confession proved crucial to the prosecution. The housekeeper detailed years of willful ignorance and the money she'd accepted to mind her own business. Her testimony corroborated Emily's account and implicated several prominent community members who had participated in the scheme. As the judge ordered, the defendants remanded to custody. The Blackwood name, once associated with medical excellence and social standing, became synonymous with depravity and abuse of power. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, flashbulbs illuminating the faces of survivors and their families. Outside, Emily found David waiting. The young man who had endured captivity alongside her pulled her into a gentle embrace. For the first time since their rescue, they allowed themselves to imagine a future beyond trauma, a life they might build together. Margaret approached them slowly, still adjusting to her daughter's adulthood. She announced her decision to sell the mansion. Unable to bear its walls, knowing what had happened within them, the proceeds would establish a foundation for the other girls rescued from the farm. "It's over," Emily whispered, though they all knew recovery had only just begun. The verdict echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Dr. Harold Westbrook and his co-conspirators sat stone-faced as the judge pronounced them guilty on all counts. Margaret Blackwood clasped her hands tightly, tears streaming down her face, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief that justice had finally prevailed. 7 years, she whispered to Emily, who sat beside her, shoulders straight despite the weight of all she had endured. 7 years, but we won. The Blackwood name, once synonymous with medical excellence and social prestige in Salem, Massachusetts, now carried a different legacy, a cautionary tale of power corrupted and innocence betrayed. As reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, Detective Thomas O'Malley shielded the family from the barrage of questions, his weathered face showing both satisfaction and weariness. "This case will change how we investigate disappearances," he told Margaret later that evening. "No stone unturned. No explanation accepted without proof, not even from the most respected members of our community." Emily and David found quiet moments together between court appearances and medical appointments. Their shared trauma had forged an unbreakable bond between them. Sitting on a park bench one crisp autumn afternoon, David took Emily's hand. "I never thought I'd have a future," he admitted, his voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. "Now I can't stop thinking about it," Emily smiled, the first genuine smile Margaret had seen in months. "I want to build something new," she said, "something completely different from what they tried to make us." Margaret sold the mansion within weeks of the trial's conclusion. The sprawling Victorian house, with its hidden compartments and terrible secrets, fetched a considerable sum despite its notorious history. She couldn't bear to step through its doors again, knowing what had transpired within those walls. "What will you do with the money?" Martha Sullivan asked, as she helped pack the last of the belongings they wished to keep. "Give it purpose," Margaret replied firmly, "the way we're trying to give purpose to our pain." The housekeeper nodded, her hands steady but her eyes downcast with the lingering shame of her years of silence. She had testified against Dr. Westbrook, her words helping to seal his fate. But Martha knew her penance was just beginning. With the proceeds from the sale, Margaret purchased a modest but sunlit home across town. No hidden rooms, no dark corners, just open spaces and windows that welcomed the light. She established a trust fund for the other survivors and made plans for a foundation that would advocate for missing children and support those who had been trafficked. Detective O'Malley visited on the day they moved in, bringing a housewarming gift, a simple wind chime for the porch. "To replace silence with music," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I'm retiring next month. This case, your family's courage. That's how I want to end my career." The spring sunshine bathed the garden of their new home as Emily Blackwood and David prepared for their new life together. 6 months had passed since the trial, and the wounds were slowly healing. Emily cradled her son, Jonathan David, named both in defiance and reclamation, taking back the name Blackwood and honoring the man who had helped save her. The infant's eyes, bright and curious, held none of the shadows that still occasionally haunted his mother's gaze. Margaret moved through the sunlit kitchen, arranging flowers from their garden. At 45, her face showed the lines of grief, but also newfound purpose. She watched through the window as Emily and David sat together on the porch swing, their heads bent close in conversation. The intimacy between them, forged in darkness but flourishing in light, brought tears to her eyes. "They deserve every moment of happiness," Martha said, joining Margaret at the window. The former housekeeper had become family now, her initial complicity through silence transformed into fierce dedication to the survivors. She had sold her small house to help fund what they now called the Blackwood Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting victims of trafficking and abuse. Detective O'Malley visited often, though today he came with news rather than just friendly conversation. "We've identified 3 more children," he told Margaret quietly. "Families who never knew the truth about their adoptions. The FBI is handling the notifications with care." Margaret nodded, her hands steady as she arranged the last bloom. "Will they contact us?" "That's their choice," O'Malley replied, "but your foundation's resources are available to them." Outside, Emily rose from the swing, passing the baby to David. She had begun speaking at schools and community centers, her soft voice growing stronger with each telling of her story. The nightmares still came, but less frequently now. David understood them without explanation, often sitting with her through the darkest hours until dawn broke. Together, they had created a home defined by openness, large windows, unlocked doors, rooms filled with light. The contrast to the mansion where Emily had been imprisoned could not have been more profound. Here, voices carried freely through hallways, and laughter was no longer a distant memory. As evening fell, Margaret joined her daughter, grandson, and David on the porch. Martha brought out lemonade, and O'Malley shared stories from his early days on the force. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by the baby's occasional coos. In these moments, Margaret found a peace she had thought forever lost 7 years ago. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" Emily asked, her voice soft but certain. Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. "Yes," she answered, "we already are."